Good evening. I don't know what style of preaching you might enjoy or not enjoy. If you like vim and vigor and fire and energy from start to finish, you're going to be disappointed tonight. I'm going to do something more academic and educational tonight. And so that means we'll be at a little slower pace maybe, and yet maybe even a little shorter in our overall time, because I want to do something with you this evening based out of a question that came up in our Bible study on Wednesday night. While we were studying Wednesday night, if you recall, it was a question that came up about how long had it been from the time that Adam existed, the time, the days of Adam, until Noah arrives on the scene, and in particular then when the flood came, how long had it been? Because in your mind you think, well, it must not have been that long, because Genesis 1 to Genesis 6 isn't a long span of paper, but it is a long span of history. It's about 1,000 or so years. We'll see that here in just a moment. It's interesting to think about the fact that the New Testament really only deals with about 33 some odd years of Jesus, and then if John is the last one, most likely is, and if he was able to get to an older age, even if he's getting up into his 90s, you're still under 100-year span, roughly. From the start of Matthew until the end of Revelation is only about 100 years span. So the New Testament is really a relatively short historical document, whereas the Old Testament is almost a complete history of man. For quite a while. And so tonight we're going to try to ask this question then, how long have I been here? And not you in particular, but how long has man existed on the earth? And side point, by the way, and maybe just as important though, if we can determine how long man has been on the earth, we can also determine how old the earth is. Because recall that God created the world in 7 days, 6 days, and then took a break, right? Took a rest at the end of that. And man is created within that window of time, along with all the other aspects of the earth. And so because we have such just a short week of time that the world was created, if we can figure out where Adam fits in the timeline, then we can also figure out where the earth fits in that timeline as well. And so that'll be our effort tonight. Now, let me answer the question from Wednesday night, just because that's fair. If that's what sparked the study, then let me answer that one quickly, and it'll come back up later in the discussion. But Wednesday night's question was, how long between Adam and Noah? If you go to Genesis 5, what it does is it tells us how old Noah was, or rather Adam was, and then it moves on to the next one. He had his son, then the next and the next. And if you add it all up, if I did the math right, you're talking about 1,056 years to Noah's birth. So from the time Adam comes on the scene at the very beginning of things until the time that Noah is born, you've got about 1,056 years. So from Genesis 1 to Genesis 6 is an over 1,000-year period of time. Now it's interesting, by the way, to note that Adam, I believe if I counted them correctly, had great grandchildren that he lived with in the same lifespan, because they were living much longer periods of time in those days. And so Adam actually saw his 6 great grandchildren as they came on the scene in his lifespan. But if you want to talk about Noah's birth, then you're dealing with the idea of about 1,056 years from Adam to there. If you add then the fact that he's 500 years old when Shim is born, and so you can add another 500 to that, you're at roughly 1,556 years. And when he leaves the ark, the Bible, I believe, tells us he was 601 years old. So you add 101 to the 1,556, and you get 657 years from the time of Adam until the time that Noah and his family finally walk off the ark. That's the question answered, as best as I can answer it, that we had Wednesday night. But we want to do more than that. We want to understand maybe if we can fit all of the history of man from the biblical narrative and kind of get a sense of how long have we been here and how long the earth has been here based on that. And so let me just share a couple of precursors, if you will. Number one, we generally talk about AD and BC, right? We talk about AD. Sometimes we get confused about that, but basically it's Anno Domini in Latin, which simply means in the year of the Lord. Our calendar is based upon the time period in which Jesus arrived on the scene. And that calendar has been well respected and used by men since that time forward. As men begin to figure out exactly how long they've been around. Now, modernists will debate that or challenge it. They don't necessarily debate when 0 is, or if they didn't have 0, then where 1 is. They don't debate that. They just don't like the connection to Jesus, and so they'll do things with that. BC then simply means before that time. So if in the year of the Lord, Anno Domini in Latin, is the time period where we're beginning the conversation of our calendar, then BC is anything before that. Before Christ, before the year of the Lord, if you will. Now, once in a while in modern times, you'll see this. You'll see some folks try to avoid the connection to Jesus. And so sometimes on a date, you'll see the letter CE, which simply means common era. And so they don't like the idea that we're attaching our very calendar system to Jesus. We wouldn't want to do that, would we? That's a mindset of some. And so they say, let's not talk about how AD, Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. Let's call it the common era. It's still 2019. It's still the same time period. But they try to get away from connecting it to Jesus. And then sometimes they'll even refer to BC before that common era. And so if you see that kind of abbreviations or things connected, you might see that when it comes to dating from time to time. But the legitimate calendar was based on the idea of when Jesus arrived and everything before that. And so I think we can easily argue tonight that we're dealing at least with 2019 years, right? As we've been counting up and we're in the year 2019, and I think that I don't know anybody who would try to argue against that we've been here at least 2019 years. And now we could argue a year or two here and there in relationship to when that calendar actually started, but everybody that I know of, from scholar to biblical believer to non-biblical believer, all of us generally accept those 2019 years as having happened since the time that Jesus of Nazareth rose onto the scene. Now, archaeological finds, and again, this date can be debated by a year or two, but not by a wide margin, would say that the fall of Jerusalem happened, not the one in AD 70, the one back in terms of Babylon coming down and dealing with Jerusalem, that occurred roughly in 588 BC. Now keep in mind, as you're coming from Adam to the time of Jesus, numbers are getting smaller. As we're working from the time of Jesus to Adam, numbers are getting larger. And so here you have in 588 roughly, some will say 586. I read somebody today said 587. But generally speaking, people will accept within a year or two that event, even archaeologically proven, happened around 588 BC. And so we've got our first 2019 years that everybody kind of agrees to, because you've got the year of the Lord, you know when that happened, 2019 years. And roughly, just about anybody and everybody you would speak to would accept the idea from archaeological evidence, even if they ignored Scripture, that the fall of Jerusalem under the challenge that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians brought happened in around 588 BC. So the next natural question then is, can we do anything further than that? If those are just generally accepted, 2019 and 588, if those are just kind of accepted and embraced, can we do more than that? If we've got these hitching posts, if you will, if we've got these time periods in which we kind of everybody agrees to, then can we begin to examine the biblical narrative and grow and get a better idea of exactly how long we've been here? So let's go into that text that Gary read just a moment ago in Ezekiel chapter 4. And let's see what we learn from this point in time. What's happening in this book, in Ezekiel chapter 4, is God is going to make Ezekiel lay on one side for the years of Israel's existence, and then He's going to add a few more years or a few more days at equal years on behalf of how long Judah sustained itself beyond Israel. And notice with me, beginning in verse 4, lie also on your left side and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of days that you lie on it, you shall bear their iniquity. For I have laid on you the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So lay on your side for 390 days, but that equals the 390 years that Israel existed from the time of the division after Solomon. So we've got 390 years there. Then he says, when you've completed them, verse 6, lie again on your right side. Then you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have laid you a day for each year. And so what we have there is a basic understanding of how long the divided kingdom period lasted. You've got the 390 of Israel. You add the 40 of Judah going beyond those days of Israel. Now, poor Ezekiel, imagine that. You think that you go through a day or two that's pretty boring. Imagine laying on one side for 390 days and 40 more days after that. 430 days of him just laying there in a show of the iniquity of the people. For the 430 years, the kingdom of God was in a divided state. And so if the fall happens in and around 588, what we can do now is we can add the 390 and the 40 to that, and now we're at about 1018 BC. We've been able to add almost 500 years to the biblical timeline. Well, there's other things the Bible points to. So that tells us the length of time between the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon to the point in time that Israel and Judah had been dealt with, and God defines how long that was for us. And so that gets us back to Solomon. So can we figure out any way to add some time as it relates to the reign of Solomon? Well, look first at 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 42. Notice he said, and the period that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. All right, so divided kingdom happened after Solomon. Now we also add the idea that he reigned for 40 years. And you can add 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 to maybe give us a little extra help in determining some time periods. But in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come up out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. So you got a 40-year reign. It's the 4th year of that reign. And then we also learn that happened 480th year after the children of Israel had come up out of the land of Egypt. And so what we just learned there from those two narratives is we can add the 37 years roughly, and depending on how you pinpoint, because you get credit for a year even if you did one day. But so let's add 37 for the time period after the temple, and we can then add the 480 years after the Exodus. And now we're at about 1534 BC. If we add these time periods together as it relates to the time of Solomon and his reign and when the temple began and how long it was after that, and so we can get a basic imagery. And so you might say, why 479? Well, he said because it was in the 480th year. And so what I take from that is it was 479 years ago. If you're in the 480th year of something, is why we did it that way. You could add one more if you wanted to when you're talking about these kinds of numbers. So, 1534 BC roughly. So then from the time of the Exodus back to Abraham can we figure out anything as it relates to that? Well, go into Genesis chapter 12 and verse 40. Genesis chapter 12 and in verse 40. Nope, that's not going to... Exodus chapter 12. I'm going to say, unless my eyes are playing tricks on me too. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. That'll work. She said, now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. All right, so we just learned back in the text before, in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, that temple that Solomon built happened in the 480th year after they left Egypt. Now we've just learned in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 40 that they had been in Egypt for 430 years before they left. And so we've got an extra piece of time now that we can add to our timeline. If you go over into Galatians chapter 3 and verse 17, in Galatians chapter 3 and in verse 17, notice he says, "In this I say that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect." So you have both an Old Testament text telling us that it was a 430-year period while they were in Egypt. Moses leads them out and gets the law. Galatians 3:17 validates that time period as well. That 430 years when you date it clear back. So you've got the 430 back to 1964 BC that you can begin to see how we continue throughout this time. So now we're clear back to the days of Abraham. And we begin to think about how Abraham fits into this biblical timeline. In Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4, in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 4, we learned that Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And so we've dealt with the Exodus, we've dealt with the time period prior to that, we've dealt with the time period in which Solomon, and we learned those things. Well, now we learned that Abraham was 75 years old when he entered into Canaan. So we'll add 75 more years to our number. We're at roughly 2039 BC. And now go over into Genesis chapter 11 for a minute. In Genesis chapter 11 and in verse 10, we get one of these lengthy segments. And bear with me a little bit here as we go through this. But in Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 10, this is the genealogy of Shim. Shim was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. And he begot Arphaxad. Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Selah. After he begot Selah, Arphaxad lived 403 years, begot sons and daughters. Sajah lived 30 years and begot Ebor. Skip to verse 16. Ebor lived 34 years and begot Peleg. I almost say Pele there, but anyway. Then there's verse 18. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reuel. Verse 20. Reuel lived 32 years and begot Serug. Verse 22. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. 24. Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. Verse 26. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And so basically what we have there is a timeline of how we can get from Abraham to Noah's grandson, Arphaxad. And when you add all of those up, at the age in which each one begot the next person, and you added all those numbers up that we just read to you in fast order, you come up with another 290 years from the time of Abraham to the time going the other direction, going back in history to Noah's grandson, Arphaxad. So we add 290 to our number. We're at roughly 2329 BC, according to the biblical history narrative. Now, we also learned, right, that Arphaxad was born 2 years after the flood, the text said. So let's add those two real quick into the mix. 2331, and so you're easily 4,300 to 4,400 years ago in which the time of the flood occurred. And so if you want to run it from Adam to Noah, we did that, and now you can kind of run it the other way. It was a roughly 4,300 to 4,400 years ago that the flood came upon the earth. And in more specific, probably around 2331 BC, that those things concluded. Now, go over into Genesis, or backwards into Genesis chapter 8. Let's notice a couple of things about Noah. So in Genesis chapter 8 and verse 13, it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And so we learned that it's in the 601st year of Noah that the flood was over. Arphaxad was born, what? 2 years after the flood. Noah was 601 years old, or in the 601st year, when the flood ended. If you add chapter 9 of Genesis and verse 28, Noah lived after the flood 350 years, so all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Noah lived a long, long time. And within that period of the flood, Noah was either 601, depending on how you want to look at that phrase, in the 601st year. So either he's 601 or maybe 600 years old. And we've already added the 2 years that Arphaxad adds to the discussion, so we're roughly now at 2931 BC, working back to Adam. Okay, well, can I get from Noah to Adam? We kind of know where Noah fits in this. Can I get from Noah to Adam? And that's the text we were looking at the other night on Wednesday when we were discussing this genealogy and history to begin with. If you read Genesis 5, 3 through 29, I am not going to bore you like I did a minute or two ago by reading every other verse. But we could do that, and I'm not opposed to it, but just get the picture. Notice verse 3. Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image, and named him Seth. I might have said Shim earlier, by the way, and I meant Seth. Then Seth lived, verse 6, 105 years and begot Enosh. Enosh lived 90 years, verse 9, and begot Cainan. Verse 12, Cainan lived 70 years and begot Mahil. Verse 15, Mahila lived 65 years and begot Jared. And that just keeps going. You go every third verse and you'll see another person who comes on the scene and was a certain age when they begot the next. If you do all of that, you're going to see that you have 130 plus 105 plus 90 plus 70 plus 65 plus 162, 65, 187. I want you to think about that for a second. You think maybe you started your family late. Imagine being 187 years old when you started your family. But that's kind of the way it was for a couple of these folks at the end. But if you add all these years up, as the Bible's telling us how old each of them were when they had their son that's in the genealogy, we can now add the 1,056 that we mentioned at the outset, which is putting us roughly at 3,987 BC, when the earth and Adam first were created in God's timeline. And so roughly that means the earth has been around for a little over 6,000 years. According to the biblical timeline, the earth has been here for a little over 6,000 years. Now here's what's interesting about that. When we look at that, because we see it from the biblical perspective, we think of that as a long span of time, right? We think of 6,000 years as a long time. To the evolutionists, that's too young. To the evolutionists, they can't fathom the idea that the earth is that young. They can't imagine how it's possible for the things that exist upon this earth to exist if the earth has only been around for 6,000 or so years. The great answer I've always felt to that difficulty or challenge is simply this. God didn't create the earth to then allow it to evolve to what it needed to be. He created the earth as it needed to be from the beginning. Adam and Eve weren't created as babies and then allowed to figure out how they're going to grow and there's nobody there to help them. But they're going to have to... No, He created them in adult functioning form. They were able to sustain themselves from the very moment God created them. And the same thing is with the earth. The earth had all things necessary to sustain it when it was created. And therefore there's no issue really whatsoever in the idea that the earth may have only been around for a little over 6,000 years. Because what we have to simply take into account is the manner in which God created it, ready to sustain life from the beginning. You don't need thousands of years when God creates it ready to be used. You don't need all that time and effort that the evolutionists look for when God created it ready to be purposed the way it is. You know, and we have things common to that, by the way, that idea. There are things that we take for granted, maybe even on a daily basis, that are already complete and ready in the form that you received them. You ever ate a TV dinner? Right? Or something like it? Well, you didn't get your pots and pans out, did you? And you didn't get the flour and the materials and get your eggs out and all the items that you needed in order to put together in their infant form, if you will, to prepare the meal. You poured it out ready to go. It was already done in its completed form. My point is simply this. The earth was created in its completed form. It was ready to be purposed and used as God designed it for. I believe from this biblical narrative that we examine tonight, we can easily state that the earth is roughly 6,000 years old. And so is man. Because man was here when the earth was here, and the earth was here when man was here. And if the biblical timeline shares with us very specifically, by the way, you think about that. He doesn't say Adam might have been. He says Adam was 130 years old when this child was born. And when that child had his child, that person was 105 years old. And the next one was 90 years old. I mean, it's very specific. And you go back and you add all of these verses together, you can work a legitimate timeline of how long the earth has been around. There you go. Education 101, I guess, when it comes to how long the earth has been here. I need a break from math for a couple days. I've been staring at this now since about Thursday morning when I started working. I want to thank Pam, sent me a thing that she had worked on some time ago that lent a hand. I'm sure that some of this material I've gathered from some other sources that I've long forgotten from whom or where. But the biblical narrative is pretty clear. And I realize I might have gone through that faster than you wanted to, but I was just trying to show very clearly where that timeline hits in the verses of Scripture. And I'll be glad to share this with you if you want to look at it later and soak a little more of that in and not do the speed reading version that I did. If you want to spend more time with it, I'll be glad to share those charts with you so that you can go back and look at those verses and do the math yourself and see how it all adds up. The gospel message of Jesus Christ was intended to be brought before the foundation. Before the 6,000 years ago happened, God had a plan and determined to bring salvation to man through His Son. We have a great opportunity through Him to know salvation and redemption. All of this history is laid out before us for that intent and purpose, to ultimately bring Jesus. It is fair and right that our present calendar is in the year of the Lord, 2019. Because Jesus Christ is the hub and center of everything that man needs to focus upon from the time that He arrives upon the earth. If you're subject to the gospel in some way tonight, know that God put all that history, laid it all out there, and then told us exactly how it all fit together in order for us to be able to come to know Him and His Son and the salvation in Him. If we could help you tonight in obedience to the gospel or to pray for you tonight, won't you come as we stand and as we sing?